historical detective novels by Catherine Shaw, which some of you may be familiar with or may not. But basically, fiction and mathematics, there's an assumption that that means Alice in Wonderland and Flatland, and I want to argue that, well, to show that there's a lot more to it than that. So this is going to be a whistle-stop tour of some highlights of fiction and mathematics. One might start by looking at fiction by mathematicians like Charles Dodson, Lewis Carroll, and there are a few. The logician Hugh McCall wrote some novels. Charles Howard Hinton wrote novels exploring dimensions. Sofia Kovalevskaya wrote a number of literary works, including one novel, and she has the unusual distinction of also appearing as a fictional character in a story by a winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, Alice Munro's Too Much Happiness, from years ago. Felix Hausdorff wrote literary works, but not, as far as I know, exactly fiction. There are writers who had a background in mathematics, and these include, well, Fatih Kongoli, Albanian writer who chose to work as a mathematician rather than a writer under communism, and then went back to writing more recently. Alexander Solzhenitsyn studied maths at university, as did G.M. Coetzee, two Nobel Prize winners. Coetzee actually did a PhD performing computer analysis of the works of Samuel Beckett. So a very strong mathematical background there. But relatively few contemporary mathematicians, as far as I know, write novels. One of them is Jordan Ellenberg, who's wrote one novel called The Grasshopper King a few years ago. And I've sometimes wondered, it seems to me odd that there are apparently so few. It may simply be my ignorance, and that's really quite possible, or is there some reason why mathematics and fiction are in some way exclusive? Here's Scott Ellenberg's reason why he turned to mathematics rather than fiction recently.
I'm not publicising the novel in the math world. I'm suffering from a paranoid fear that someone on a tenure committee somewhere will take its existence as a sign that I'm not fully committed to mathematics. Actually, in case any tenure committees are reading this, I might as well say that I am fully committed to mathematics. The fact is, mathematics is easier and a lot less painful than writing novels. Also, you get tenure.
And Ellenberg has also said that every day he spent being a literary novelist meant half a day moping around that he wasn't doing mathematics. So I don't think he plans to write any more novels at the moment. So these are mathematicians who write novels. What about novelists who write mathematics? There is one, David Foster Wallace, novelist, as he wrote a book about transparent active set theory. But that crossover is probably even more rare than going the other way. Okay, so my rough list of uses of mathematics in fiction begins with fiction which explores mathematics and its consequences, fiction which looks at the creative process of mathematics. I've got a couple of examples of comments on maths education, fiction based on mathematical structures, which is a huge topic I will skate over. Other, I'll come back to, fiction which uses mathematicians as characters, and the sort of recurrent theme, as it was a little bit in Heather's talk and Marcus's, is what is the role of mathematicians in fiction? Is it entirely positive? So some examples, and I'm afraid there's going to be lots of examples here. I do have a list on the web, and somebody else has a much better list, of novels of mathematical interest. Cryptography appears, for example, in The Gold Bug and in The Dancing Men in Sherlock Holmes, and in many other novels. Quantum physics appears a lot for, obviously, the many worlds theory in particular is nice to explore in fiction. I think Andrew Cummings' Mobius Dick is probably my favourite title. For some reason, logicians seem to explore logic through crime novels. So we have the Oxford Murders, made into a film a few years ago, Logic in Oxford. A certain ambiguity is looking at axiomatic systems in mathematics and in life. I'm rather fond of Pythagorean crimes, which is not perhaps plain literature, but is a fascinating story. The hero is a young mathematician in Paris in 1900, who spends the afternoon hearing Clifford outline the 35 problems for the 20th century, and the evening discussing mathematics with Picasso in the local bar. And it's all good fun. I just mentioned, last year, no fewer than 2 novels appeared which explored, well, which started off in the premise that the Riemann hypothesis has been proved. 2 very different novels, a thriller by Bergson, which I have to say I wouldn't really recommend, and a rather brilliant novel by Matt Haig, in my opinion, called The Humans, which starts off with the assumption that the mathematicians proved the Riemann hypothesis and that a race of extraterrestrials have to respond to this threat to the future of space civilization by basically removing him and impersonating him. Not much mathematics in the novel, but it's a very nice exploration of what it is to be human. Okay, mathematical ideas, graph theory used to solve a murder. In Claude Berger's story Who Killed the Duke of Dunsmore, the detection rests on a rather sophisticated theorem in graph theory. And it's very unusual, I think, in that regard. Moving on to fiction about doing mathematics, I was very impressed as a young graduate reading Rebecca Goldstein's Mind-Body Problem, in which the heroine is married to a mathematical genius at Princeton. Uncompleted Austen Goldbach's Conjecture is a wonderful study of a life spent unsuccessfully working on a difficult maths conjecture. Sue Wolf's Leaning Towards Infinity presents a rather alarming view of the misogynistic math community. There's a particularly, it might be horrifying, scene in which a female mathematician presenting at a conference gets taken apart by the audience, by the male audience. I didn't at the time feel that was a particularly plausible scene, but when I read about the Marion Bossalon affair and the Over the Monty Hall problem, it's perhaps not as far away from reality as I would like to think. And somebody mentioned yesterday, Logic Comics, the Bertrand Russell as superhero, tackling the world's most important problems with mathematics. Then there's fiction explaining mathematics, expository fiction. An interesting category here is the fiction mathematicians invent to explain new ideas. The Zeno's paradoxes, Achilles and the tortoise, Schrodinger's cat. These are stories that mathematicians make up purely to explain a mathematical idea, and they possibly deserve study. And then there are books like George Gamo's Mr. Tompkins series, in which his hero discovers is led through relativity and quantum theory and something like that, and more recent similar books. My prime exhibit here, until recently I thought this was unique, Donald Knuth's novel Serial Numbers is possibly the only time that a mathematical idea has appeared in print first in a novel, and only later as a mathematical exposition. This was John Conway's Serial Numbers. Knuth's novel came out in 1974. Conway's book, which is equally entertaining, in 1976. So here we have first publication as fiction. And as I've said, I thought that was unique. A book which came out last year, tried to persuade otherwise. Michael Tsukyun Choi is arguing that Jane Austen's novels are actually all about game theory.
In this book, I argued that Jane Austen systematically explored the core ideas of game theory in her 6 novels, roughly 200 years ago. Austen's novels do not simply provide case material for the game theorist to analyse, but are themselves an ambitious theoretical project with insights not yet superseded by modern social science.
I don't think everyone necessarily agrees that although I think there's general agreement that Austen's novels are very effective in exploring certain aspects of game theory, of what is not game theory. Okay, moving on to maths education. Most writers, this may not happen in the future if Neelu does his way, but most writers have some experience of maths education, so it's perhaps not surprising it comes in some fiction. Here's a passage which I particularly like because it goes along with things that I've been arguing for, from Gavin Lexman's novel The Universe versus Alex Wood's, about autistic teenager.
Of course, I didn't mind learning facts. I liked learning facts, but it would have been nice to have had context too. For example, in physics, they taught us all about gravity, that F equals ma, and about Newton's laws of motion, which we had to learn word for word. But they taught us nothing about Newton himself. When I looked him up on the internet, I discovered that Newton was a pretty weird and interesting guy. It turned out that he'd come up with gravity and his laws of motion while he had nothing else to do because he was locked away at home, hiding from the plague, brain-bound. That was pretty interesting. It also turned out that he invented a new type of telescope and spent a lot of his spare time trying to turn base metal into gold. These things were pretty interesting too. And then I found out he had wild, staring eyes, crazy silver hair, and an arch enemy called Robert Hooke, who may have been a hunchback. All this was really interesting. It turned out that science had some great stories and characters, but you never got to hear about them in science lessons. I'm not saying that we should have spent hours and hours learning Newton's biography, but 5 minutes would have been nice. Knowing a bit about Newton makes F equal ma all the more inspiring. But unfortunately, knowing about Newton was not in the exams. It was irrelevant.
And rightly so.
Fine. Here is our maths teacher struggling with Pythagoras' theorem with a group of fairly acute boys. Apologies to those who already know this one.
This morning, I said to them, we are going to prove that the square on the hypotenuse of a right-angled triangle is equal to the sum of the squares on the other 2 sides. Is that likely to happen? Mason asked. I told the others to be quiet and asked Mason what he meant. I mean, is a right-angled triangle likely to have a square on its hypotenuse? I'm afraid I don't quite follow you, Mason, he said. If I draw a right-angled triangle on the board, and then draw a square on the side opposite to the right angle, it has got a square on its hypotenuse. The question whether it is likely to have such a square does not arise. Not on the board, sir, no. But I mean in real life. I mean, if real-life triangles don't have squares on their hypotenuses, then there wouldn't be much point in proving that they're equal to whatever they're equal to. Would it, sir?
And so on. So again, carrying on from my categories, there's novels about maths prodigies, things like Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. Nikita Lalvani's Gifted is about a young female mathematical prodigy and her relationship with her parents, and particularly her father, who was rather keen on her being a maths prodigy. And again, there's an interesting element here in these books, why they're successful, why people choose to write about young mathematicians in this way. Moving on to mathematical structures, I mean, there's far too much to say here for me to attempt to say it today. It goes back, for example, to Christian Shandy, where we've got these nice diagrams showing the non-linear structure of the narrative in the story itself. The Oulipo, the French, mainly French group of mathematicians and writers who did all sorts of experimental, still do all sorts of experimental fiction based on mathematical ideas, whom George Perec is probably the prime exponent, and who wrote some works with incredible constraints on them. I thought I'd just mention the only book I've ever bought because of the errata slip. This is Alistair Gray, a Scottish writer's unlikely stories mostly, and it has an errata slip. It says errata, this slip has been inserted by mistake. Right. And one I came across quite recently, which again, a stay of curiosity, is Not Awake by Matt O'Keefe, in which the length of the words, starting with the title, give you the first 10,000 digits of pi, and he throws all sorts of literary forms within the book. So I mean, there's an awful lot more we said there, and perhaps that's where the real interest in mathematical fiction might come from. I had a category called Other, which I reserve for Jorge Luis Borges, whose I think takes mathematical fiction to a level quite beyond anything anybody else has ever done. And then there's mathematicians in fiction, and all sorts of mathematicians appear in fiction. I'm only going to mention a couple here. Ian Pearce wrote An Instance of the Finger Post, a highly unlikely New York Times bestseller in 1998, which I think is described as an exploration of how a detective novel would work in the 17th century. He said you can't have Sherlock Holmes style detection at that time because the whole worldview is so completely different. So he tried to show how detectives, or what would now be called detectives, whose detectives would be told at that time. And all sorts of mathematicians have been appropriated for all sorts of reasons. Here is Gauss, the hero of a comic novel, which again was a bestseller a few years ago, and all the mathematicians you'd expect, and many you wouldn't, have appeared in fiction. Possibly going back even to Clavius in John Donne's Ignatius's Conclave, where Clavius is presented as the villain in John Donne's satire. So I thought it might be interesting to have a look at one mathematician in particular. So I'm going to have a quick run through of a number of fictional appearances of Isaac Newton, and these are intended to show the variety of different uses to which Newton has been put in fiction. So here is Newton in Neil Stevenson's Quicksilver, a lengthy trilogy about the early history of Law Society.
When Isaac showed up one day, alarmingly late in his academic career, with a few shillings, and bought a copy of Barrow's Latin translation of Euclid, Barrow didn't seem to mind. It was a tiny book with almost no margins, but Isaac wrote in the margins anyway, in near microscopic print. Just as Barrow had translated Euclid's Greek into the universal tongue of Latin, Isaac translated Euclid's ideas, expressed as curves and surfaces, into algebra. Here's
a modern view of Euclid from the heroine of Peter Hoog's novel Miss Miller's Feeling for Snow, from about 1990 something. Different title in the US for some reason.
My only spiritual brother is Newton. I was moved when at the university they introduced us to the passage in Principia Mathematica, Book 1, where he tips a bucket full of water and uses the tilted surface of the water to argue that within and surrounding the rotating earth and the turning sun and the tumbling stars, which make it impossible to find any constant starting point, and initial system and fixed point in life, there is absolute space. That which stands still, that to which we can cling. I could have kissed Newton.
Here is Newton helping his housekeeper with some arithmetic in George Bernard Shaw's play In Good King Charles' Golden Days.
Since you have one of your calculating fits on, I wonder if you would mind doing a little sum for me to check the washing bill. How much is 3 times 7? 3 times 7. Oh, that is quite easy. I suppose it is to you, sir, but it beats me. At school I got as far as addition and subtraction, but I could never do multiplication or division. Why, neither could I. I was too lazy. But they are quite unnecessary. Addition and subtraction are quite sufficient. You add the logarithms of the numbers, and the anti-logarithm of the sum of the two is the answer. Let me see. 3 times 7. The logarithm of 3 must be decimal 477, or thereabouts. The logarithm of 7 is, say, decimal 845. That makes 1.322, doesn't it? What's the anti-logarithm of 1.322? Well, it must be less than 22 and more than 20. You will be safe if you put it down as 21.
Here's Newton in a farce by Fidelis Morgan.
Newton was prostrate, trying to slide himself under Godfrey's bed. Dredged with flour, he now resembled a pretty winter landscape. With a slither, he disappeared under the bed. Then, nestling to Godfrey's chamber pot, he started pulling piles of books and manuscripts round himself for protection, whimpering all the while.
Here's Newton in Derek Bevan's novel Newton's Niece, I think again 1990s.
He never dressed up or received company. He rarely washed, combed his hair, or lurched as far as his wig. So preoccupied was he with the race against matter. And currently, I guessed, the impossible disorder Fatio had already caused to his carefully cauterized feelings.
This is Newton in another detective story set in the 17th century, this one by Philip Kerr, in which he doesn't appear to go along with the Ian Pear's view that you can't have Sherlock Holmes in the 17th century.
Excellent. Newton knocked the table once, as if keeping score. And a keen shot, I see. Perceiving my puzzlement, he added, "Is that not a gunpowder spot on your right hand?"
This is Newton in a recent novel by historian of science Rebecca Stott.
Newton had wanted to stay in Cambridge. The alternative was almost certain obscurity. He was awarded the scholarship in 1664, but the fellowship still seemed beyond reach. How far had Newton been prepared to go to secure his future? As far as murder?
James Moore's novel The Last Witchfinder is slightly curious in that the narrator is the book Principia Mathematica. And in this scene, the heroine is meeting Newton in his study.
Howbeit before I depart, let me toss a valuable nugget of celestial mechanics your way. Newton reached towards his chestnut periwig, seizing the longest curl like a carillonneur pulling a bell rope. Since writing my Principia Mathematica, I've come to see 'tis fornication, not gravitation, causes the planets to wander.
I should probably say that it turns out that is not Newton. It turns out that Robert Hooke was writing Newton's study when he was disturbed and has to pretend to be Newton for the purposes of that scene. And lastly, here is a rather symbolic Newton in Scarlett Thomas's The End of Mr. Y.
Everyone is looking at the same thing, gasping and making firework display noises. It's the Newton building. It's falling down.
So, as you can see, a lot of different uses of Newton there, from murderer to figure of farce to serious mathematician, not necessarily constrained by any historical accuracy or whatever. That's probably unfair. But just showing you the wide variety of uses to which novelists put fictional mathematicians. Good real mathematicians in the fiction. And of course this is controversial. Some people would say that you shouldn't misrepresent real people in fiction. This came up with David Leavitt's book, Indian Clark, 6 years ago, when certainly the reviewer for the British Academy of Mathematics complained that he had been unfair to some of the characters in giving them sentiments they may or may not have actually held in real life. And obviously there are different views on this. I would argue that fiction is fiction, and the reader knows enough to not assume too much, but it's not entirely clear-cut. The Australian historical novelist Richard Flanagan said in a radio interview once that he was drawn to fiction rather than academic life because as a historical novelist he didn't have to do any research. And what's interesting are the mathematical characters that occur in novels, and again there's a proliferation of these, I think, particularly recently, and I mention particularly a very sympathetic female mathematician in Anne Lingard's book, Ian Balmer's book of recipes, and the the idealistic and actually rather ineffective mathematician in Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun, which is about to be, or is a new film, I think. For some reason that character particularly appealed to me. The first fictional mathematician I came across was in Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar, which I read as I think as an undergraduate. And so this is Irwin from The Bell Jar.
I decided to practice my new normal personality on this man, who, in the course of my hesitation, told me his name was Irwin, and that he was a very well-paid professor of mathematics. So I said, all right, and matching my stride to Irwin's, strolled down the long ice-encrusted flight at his side. It was only after seeing Irwin's study that I decided to seduce him. We sat in his study on stuffed brown leather chairs, surrounded by stacks of dusty, incomprehensible books, with huge formulas set artistically on the page like poems.
And Irwin is not entirely a sympathetic character. I mean, my feeling is that the mathematician role is almost chosen to present him as somebody who is insensitive and unfeeling, perhaps. I mean, I may be totally unfair there, but I think there is an element in which some writers use mathematicians as code for certain, not necessarily desirable properties. This possibly goes back to Sherlock Holmes, and somebody yesterday mentioned Moriarty. Here is Holmes telling Watson about Moriarty.
He is a man of good birth and excellent education, endowed by nature with a phenomenal mathematical faculty. At the age of 21, he wrote a treatise upon the binomial theorem, which has had a European vogue. On the strength of it, he won the mathematical chair at one of our smaller universities, and had, to all appearances, a most brilliant career before him. But the man had hereditary tendencies of the most diabolical kind. A criminal strain ran in his blood, which, instead of being modified, was increased and rendered infinitely more dangerous by his extraordinary mental powers. Dark rumours gathered round him in the university town, and eventually he was compelled to resign his chair and come down to London. He is the Napoleon of crime, Watson. He is the organiser of half that is evil, and of nearly all that is undetected in this great city.
What I find quite interesting about that passage is that it's not actually the mathematics that makes Moriarty the arch-villain. It's a personality defect that is almost independent of the mathematics. Whereas in other works of fiction, the mathematics is perhaps in itself enough to indicate some form of madness. Here is a few randomly chosen passages from older detective fiction. Murder by Mathematics by Hector Houghton, 1944, I think it was. The head of a university maths department gets murdered. As a former head of the department myself, I find it rather worrying, and it seems every character in the book has a motive for wanting him dead. But here is an account of his career.
From that moment, Sir Clifford never looked back. In those small and rigorously exclusive circles where international reputations are made, he won well-deserved recognition by a paper published by the Cambridge Philosophical Society under the formidable title Extensions of the Matrix Operators of Dirac and Pauli. Then, however, things began to go wrong. In austere academic backwaters, professorial heads were shaken sadly at the mention of Casey's name. The brilliant promise had not been fulfilled. Instead of continuing to write papers that were intelligible only to the initiated, Sir Clifford began to write books for the general public. His books were not exactly easy reading, but their sales were astounding. The Mystery of the Atom, for example, found almost as many readers as, in an earlier period, The Mystery of the Red Barn. To Sir Clifford, this was incontrovertible evidence of human progress. To some of his colleagues, however, it seemed a sign of his own deterioration. If they raised their eyebrows at his first bestseller, they rent their academic gowns at what followed. They remonstrated with him. He was dealt with severely in the columns of Nature. A Cambridge professor wrote a book which tore him to shreds, but it was couched in such incomprehensible language that the popular faith remained unshaken.
Here's a novel from a similar period about a mathematician who commits murder. I'm amused by the evolution of the dust jackets here. I think the first, what I assume to be the first edition, has a jacket with some mathematical formulae on it. The cheap paperback merely has an enigmatic figure and reference to a beautiful blonde, which is actually a fairly minor part in the book. And the Penguin edition, of course, is austere with just a little bit of drama at the top left.
Professor Borstelmann was not the sort of man one would think of as a murderer. There was nothing about either his appearance or his behaviour to indicate a tendency towards any kind of violence. Indeed, quite the opposite was true. For 10 years, Borstelmann had taught mathematics at the State University.
I'm trying not to give away too many spoilers here, it's almost inevitable there will be some. The next one is a giveaway as to the identity of the murderer in the book. So if you don't want to know what book, shut your eyes for the moment and I'll tell you when you can open them again. Okay, in this unnamed model, the murderer turns out to be a female mathematician. I haven't read the book myself, but I'm told that there's a strong hint that it's the practice of high-level mathematics that has driven her insane, and particularly that perhaps mathematics that isn't suitable for the female brain. That may be unfair, I'm going on what somebody else has written about this. Okay, if you've had your eyes shut, you can open them again if you wish. There are some good news from some of these books. Here's Murder by Mathematics again.
The qualities that made a good mathematician were not those that made a successful murderer.
So mathematicians are mad, potentially murderers, but not very good at it. Okay, of course mathematics has other purposes in fiction. Somebody yesterday, I'm not very good at remembering who said what at these meetings, mentioned Zemyatin's we, and here is...
Some 1,000 years ago, your heroic ancestors subjugated the entire earthly sphere to the power of the one state. Today, you are confronting an even greater conquest, the integration of the infinite equation of the universe with the electrified and fire-breathing glass integral. You are confronting unknown creatures on alien planets who may still be living in the savage state of freedom, and subjugating them to the beneficial yoke of reason. If they don't understand that we bring them mathematically infallible happiness, it will be our duty to force them to be happy.
And this was possibly an influence on George Orwell, and you will probably remember the importance of mathematics here, where
Do you remember, he went on, writing in your diary, freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 makes 4?
and of course Winston Smith, under torture, abandons, well, it's better to be that 2 + 2 is whatever the state tells them it should be. Okay, so these are some uses of mathematics in fiction. I want to finish with a particular example, and this is about novels by Catherine Shaw, which have appeared over the last 10 years, starting with The Three-Body Problem in 2004, which is, it was set in Cambridge at the time of the competition for a solution to the mathematical problem of 3 bodies mutually interacting under their gravitational forces. She moved on with Flower Stained with Moonlight, The Library Paradox, The Riddle of the River, and Fatal Inheritance. And these novels, apart from the mathematical side, deal with a variety of Victorian social issues, female education in the first, lesbianism, anti-Semitism in the third, and prostitution in the fourth. Catherine Shaw is a pseudonym. When I submitted my abstract, I didn't actually know who she was, but since I first looked, and since last week, when I first looked in last week, Wikipedia has told me who she is. She is Lila Schneps, an American mathematician living in France, who I've known as the author of a recent book, Math on Trial, written with her daughter, Coralie Colmes, which is a popular book about the use of mathematics, and particularly statistics, as evidence in court cases, which I've been using with my students over the last year. So the first book, The Three-Body Problem, is set in Cambridge in 1888. The narrator is Vanessa Duncan, a young assistant in a school for girls. The story is told in letters to her twin sister, which for me I'm afraid was rather tiresome. They're very long and unlikely letters. But basically, in order to inspire her young charges with mathematics, she tries one of Lewis Carroll's problems on them, which she's found in a ladies' magazine. And this works well. The children talk about it to their parents. She is invited to meet the brother of one of the parents, who is a mathematician, and she is drawn into mathematical circles in Cambridge just at a time that one of the mathematicians has been murdered, and it turns out that the handsome neighbour who she's been admiring is also a mathematician, is accused of the murder. So we get some set-piece scenes. Here she is listening to a lecture by Cayley.
I myself listened closely to what Professor Cayley was saying. He sat facing the audience, reading from a prepared text and looking up rarely. His voice was monotonous, his expression vinegary, and his speech rapid. And it would have been easy to lose the thread had he not been so powerful in expressing his convictions. I had not realised that the question of Euclid could raise such passions in the breasts of his adepts and his enemies.
And she learns all about the anti-Euclid League of the time and the controversy about should Euclid be taught in schools. Here's one of the modern Cambridge contemporaries at the same gathering.
It's time to proceed to a new era, Mr. Crawford was meanwhile still shouting. No more geometry, no more algebra. Mathematical physics is the new force in Cambridge.
Why, we've had Maxwell, we've had Airy, we have Stokes. What's all this geometry and algebra? Quaternions, imaginary numbers. Ha! Give me the truth. Give me reality. Give me the solar system.
And as the novel develops, she in trying to defend the mathematician, who's now accused of 3 murders, as you can probably guess from the title, she has to travel to Sweden, where she meets Gustav Leffler, who introduces her to King Oscar, whose prize for the 3-body problem is key to the plot, and so on. So it's a very neat novel. I mean, the construction is very clever, and there's a lot of mathematical interest. To be honest, I didn't expect it was likely to be very successful. I certainly didn't envisage that the publishers would bring out more in the same series, but it appears they do have a bit of following, even amongst non-mathematicians. And there's some very positive reviews on various websites from people whose only complaint is that there's some mathematics in them, basically. She went on, by the time of the 3rd book, The Library Paradox, our heroine is now married to the mathematician in the 1st book. She's the mother of 2 adorable young children who she nevertheless is able to abandon whenever she needs to for reasons of plot for however long as is necessary. The Library Paradox basically is mainly set in the East End of London, where Vanessa becomes friendly with Jewish families, moves amongst the Jewish community in a highly unlikely opinion way. But again, there's some mathematical interest here. Here she is meeting Bertrand Russell at a smart party.
Here is someone you must meet. This is Bertrand Russell, a fellow of Trinity. Your husband is at Trinity, isn't he? A presentable, almost foppish young man in his early 20s looked me up and down and inquired who my husband was, politely enough, yet a little haughtily, I thought. His name is Arthur Wetherburn, I said. You are probably acquainted with him, though I do not believe that I have ever had the pleasure of meeting you. Oh, Professor Wetherburn. I knew him, of course. I never took any of his courses, though. I'm not too interested in those matrix theories. I work in philosophy and logic. I don't actually live in Cambridge any longer. His tone subtly implied that there was no possible comparison in importance between philosophy and mere matrix theories. I asked myself why Professor Taylor had insisted.
And a moment later, she meets
Zeno's paradox states that the hare, or the faster runner Achilles, will never catch up, because whenever he reaches the place where the tortoise just was, the tortoise has already advanced from that place. Mine might not be so easy to explain as that one, but your husband is a mathematician. You are perhaps used to mathematical terminology? Well, yes, if it's not too difficult, I admitted, wondering what I was letting myself in for. And then I shall be happy to explain that to you, he said with alacrity. A discreet, dark-clothed being floated by with a tray, and I found myself holding a fluted glass of champagne. Dr. Moriarty thought he took one as well, and tapped it gently against mine, producing a pleasing ting that only beautiful crystal revealed. Drink, he said happily. All the definitions will then seem very simple. Now, do you know what a totally ordered set is?
So this is Moriarty Forte, who has just come up with a paradox in set theory and is having trouble explaining it.
But now, what if the subset you take is the entire set? You start at the left and move along to the right all of the way. You include everything. Then you have a subset which happens to be the full set, and so its ordinal number is greater than any ordinal number which is inside your subset. But your subset is the full set of ordinal numbers, so that none can lie outside it. Alas, by this time my head was spinning. I wish I could understand it better, I said regretfully. You can, said the young Bertrand Russell, who had been standing by listening. But really, I see what it is I've been trying to tell you. This makes it all much simpler. What you're really saying is, you can't have the set of sets which don't contain themselves. Of course, that's what I've been trying to formulate clearly all these last weeks. He seemed surprised and amazed at his own remark. Dr. Moriarty, 40, cast him a look of confused admiration. "I don't quite understand what you mean," he said honestly. "Neither do I chimed in, probably even much more honestly."
So our narrator has been present at the birth of Russell's paradox. And that's what, I mean, I take extracts from a rather long passage in the book, which is untypical actually in terms of the maths. So I want to think, to finish with, what is the role of the mathematics here? I mean, part of it is really the pleasure of presenting mathematics in this context, but we have these novels which are told through Vanessa's letters to her twin sister, her in the first 2 volumes. By volume 3, that has gone a bit too far, and it becomes her diary. Volumes 4 and 5 it becomes her case diary, because she's now a practicing detective. She starts off as a spinster working in school, proceeds through engagement, marriage, and private work as an investigator. She meets many eminent Victorians, not just mathematicians, but the Sir Oliver Lodge, various visiting scientists, members of the Darwin family, and in the last one, musicians from the Royal Academy of Music. And maths is her way into this community. She gets in there because of her interest in maths, her maths teaching, her innovative approach to maths teaching. She marries a mathematician. Her cases, certainly the first 4, involve more, to some extent, maths and mathematicians. And the plots are related to the maths they're writing about. They're very cleverly constructed, and although there are aspects which I find rather irritating, there is a lot of mathematical enjoyment, I think, to be had in these novels. But there's a difficulty with the narrator. She is naive, enthusiastic, very successful in that. We expect to believe that she's writing letters of thousands of words, at the end of very long days spent detecting. She comes back to her hotel room absolutely exhausted and spends a few hours writing about it to her twin sister. She travels around Europe with remarkable ease, with children, and so lots of her own children. She meddles with other people's lives in a way which is frankly terrifying. It always comes off, but the risks she takes are huge. She takes huge personal risks. She has a husband and children who are wonderful, adorable, etc., etc., but who absolutely don't get in the way when the thought wants them not to be there. And there are other possibilities. I can't really imagine a Victorian lady debating in her professional case diary whether or not to start an affair with an attractive visiting scientist. So, okay, I've read Bayard's Who Killed Roger Ackroyd, which teaches you not to take seriously, not to take literally what you're told in detective stories. Strongly recommend if you don't know it. So, what is going on here? I mean, it seems to me that these novels are much more understandable as romantic fantasies by this young teenage girl than as a real account of what's actually happening to her. It's all romance, it's all drama, it's all highly plausible. And so, a possible reading would be that these are not to be taken seriously, these are a young girl's fictitious notes. But that doesn't actually work, because the maths prevents that. A teenage girl fantasizing would not have known about advanced Cambridge mathematics today. She wouldn't know about the three-body problem in enormous detail. She wouldn't know about Russell's set theory and things like that. So I think the role of maths in this is actually to make the whole thing puzzle. It takes away any doubt one might have about the truth of what one is reading. This can't be fictitious because no fantasist could have made up the mathematical content. Therefore, unlikely though it is, the maths must be real. So I think that's a slightly unusual use of mathematics in these novels. So what I hope I've shown today is just a little bit of the variety of uses to which writers have put mathematics. Alex Kasman has a very good list of mathematical fiction. I have a shorter and less complete list. If you're going to look at my list, I suggest you wait till Monday because I'm about to update it, and I don't think you're able to do it from home. I have to do it from my university computer. But there's a lot going on. But anyway, just to conclusion, I'd like to thank you all for listening. Particular thanks to Brendan for organising what has been a very fruitful conference. And thank you very much.